Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, in which we fools attempt to share tools from philosophy, psychology, in ways that are practical for everyday life and hopefully interesting for you. My name is Boaz. I've been a renewable energy executive and founder for the last 25 years or so. And now I mostly work with organizations on transformation.
And I'm Brian. I'm an artist and a teacher and a creator, a builder, and a backyard philosopher. And welcome everybody back to the Fools and Sages podcast.
Thanks, Brian. So we did an episode previously about the continuum from dependence to independence to interdependence, and kind of unpacked a little bit of what those stages mean in terms of individual development mostly.
Right.
But we were talking offline about there being some collective elements to that also, and specifically what community is, right? Building on the idea of interdependence and like what authentic community is or organic community is compared to a lot of what people experience. And while we were talking, I was also thinking of I'm mixed about this because on one hand, the way humans have organized themselves into communities in modern life is lacking a lot of things, but also creates a lot of opportunities.
Yep, trade-offs.
Yeah. And by the same token, I believe that people are really suffering like in an existential way. And I know that men in particular, I've seen all kinds of statistics about suicide rates increasing and loneliness increasing. We know that folks aren't getting married and having kids at the same
Right.
rate that they were. So there's definitely like something
going
going on.
Yeah.
And we're both connected to a small town here in New Mexico, Madrid, New Mexico, that maybe is more of a community than a lot of places are these days. So yeah, maybe you can start by sharing your perspective a little bit on what we'd been kicking around offline, and that can get us started.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the topic of community is one that I guess I've been having on and off all my life. And I just started thinking about it, in different way. Well, not different ways, but again, and maybe deeper. In this past couple of weeks, I went. I went into one of our local restaurants, and a couple of similar old geezers like myself were sitting there, and I sat down and had lunch with them. And we talked about every different kind of community thing, and as old geezers are wont to do. And then less than I think it was about a week later, one of them passed, and there was not a clue. He was in fine health. He was still full of piss and vinegar, as far as I could tell. And then I got the news that he had passed in his sleep, and his name was Michael T. And I wanted to give a shout out to him and to the family. And Michael was quite a guy. Michael was a Vietnam vet, twice decorated with Purple Hearts. He was in the thick of it and lived to tell the tale. And Michael is somebody that in my ordinary circles, I probably would not have necessarily come across. We came from, real different life paths. But in the setting of the community, we came to know each other pretty well. And we came to share a lot of the same viewpoints about things coming from very different directions. And that got me thinking about community and just what a special thing community is. that we have kind of maybe not protected the way we might have. Uh, you know, and in our previous conversation about Wendell Berry being a student of Wallace Stegner had some glimpse into how communities are made and happen. And so, yeah, when I was young, there was a lot of thoughts about intentional communities. And, the intentional community idea, I think comes from a pure place. It comes from the instinct that maybe we can do things better. Maybe we can organize ourselves in a way that makes it easier for us to be more fulfilled, for us to raise happier children who become who they are with less obstacles, uh, or maybe with only the appropriate obstacles that help them become who they are is maybe a better way to say that. So I think we are gifted with this cursed blessing of knowing that we can do things better and we're not. We know we've done things worse. So presumably that implies we can do things even better. And I've always sort of had an instinct with that. And I think that that's where the idea of intentional community comes from. That was surely a dream in the '60s.
I I just lived for 6 months in an intentional community in Tucson, Arizona, and one thing that was really interesting about this community is that it had very few gates for somebody to be able to join. Um, there, I think anybody could buy or rent a unit.
Wow.
And then there are some expectations for how you participate in the community that are set and reinforced by the community, but they weren't rules. So, everybody was expected to kind of do something, and there was a master list of all the things you could do. And if you didn't do anything, you weren't in trouble, but somebody might come talk to you once in a while and say, "Hey, we could use some help with this or that." And so when I imagine intentional community, I usually imagine a much more kind of utopian undertaking. And this was very much not that, and it wasn't utopia at all.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um,
Right.
and and you had to deal with some kind of annoying people, and there were
Right.
there were there were some people who got really involved in the community who were difficult to deal with, right?
Turns
But
out.
yeah, but that wasn't a deal breaker for the
Uh-huh.
people
Right.
who and there are people who have been there 20, 30 years.
Well, and it's interesting because that kind of points to the difference between because intentional communities, there was a time when there was just a lot of them. And I mean literally catalogs of them. And I think I mentioned in one of our previous conversations about a place I stopped in on called Julian Woods. And that was one of, I mean, I got that out of a book, a catalog, if you will, of intentional communities. There was one right down the road here called Synergia Ranch. I think some folks might know the what was it called?
The biosphere
The Biosphere Project, yeah, where they
or the
hermetically
biodome, maybe?
yeah, it turned into a Pauly Shore movie, but that wasn't the intention. Uh, and I know some of the folks, that did that, and, for example, when you hermetically seal a building, you have some problems, like, when the sun comes out, it heats up and all the air inside expands. Well, where do you go with that, right? Well, I met the guy who built the room that had the floor with the gasket all around the bottom, and when the air volume increased, the floor sank, and it took up that extra space, and then it came out, so they were it was a serious effort to understand, some of the logistical problems, but brief digression there, but their community, I think the basis, as I recall, was you spend a third of your time on environment, which meant working on the place, a third of your time in private enterprise, and a third of your time in their theater enterprise, which they called the Theater of All Possibilities. And I think it was like a neo-Gurdjieffian idea.
This was at
And they had stuff
the biodome?
yeah, same folks, the
And
Synergia folks.
personal enterprise means just whatever you wanna do with your own time, I assume.
Yeah, and, they had I think I was told they had a cattle ranch in Australia, and they had a ferro cement junk that they sailed around the world with, and, So, that's one example of an intentional community where they have a kind of a structured, here's what we do. And if you're part of us, then you do all this. And then you've had the very free form, like no rules, like Drop City, where anything goes, and you kind of see where that side of the spectrum leads, and then you have the intentional communities that were based on religion, and all of these are somewhat intentional, right? Because we say, okay, this is what it is. You're on the bus or you're off the bus, and here's what it means to be on the bus or off the bus. And I sort of thought, when I was young, like, well, that seems like a good idea, and then the danger, of course, is that it turns into a community of people that I like and know people that I don't like. And it turns out that that maybe is not a complete world. It turns out that I guess I came to the conclusion that you don't build a community out of parts like you would build a machine, but rather it's more like a bonsai tree that maybe you can encourage to grow in a certain way that might be more aesthetic than another way, but it's a living thing that has its own nature, that has its own challenges, and it has its own life cycles, and it has its own way to fruit and flower and handle the seasons. And there's a whole thing there that we have to sort of be respectful to its organic nature.
What do you think is maybe more of the human psychology interpretation of why it doesn't work to have a community made up of people that I like? There are a few directions we could go with that, I think, and I think they're interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, the one story I mentioned before is a story about Gurdjieff, and he had a group. And sometimes these groups get referred to as work groups, where the idea is that the work is a capital W. You might have the outer work, but you're doing this inner work as well. And that was, I think, the idea with the theater of all possibilities was that was sort of there. There's a process to theater work that involves us understanding who we are so that we can act like someone differently, in the broadest sense of the terms. So yeah, there's a whole different sort of approaches to that. And in the case of Madrid, you have this interesting story. And that's part of what I was thinking, because when I was young, I grew up in it wasn't an intentional community, it was a development that had been based on the I think the idea was originally from Long Island and Levittown, created by the Levitt brothers. And it became a paradigm or a pattern that was created across the country for sort of suburban neighborhoods. And uh, I was having, over the past months, I've been having some on and off conversations with a local historian here in Madrid. And he just finished publishing a book about the history. And one of the things in his book is he was talking about the other books of history books that have been written about this community. And as I was thinking of that, I realized, that community in the suburb of Ohio, nobody's ever going to write a history book about that community because nothing really ever happened there because it wasn't really a community. It was what they call a bedroom community. So people would buy tract houses that were, like you could go down the street and you'd see the same house, but the paper had been turned over. So on one house, the garage is on the right, and on the next house, the garage is on the left, and then the next one, it's back on the right, and it goes
Common.
all the way
Yeah.
down the street. Or maybe they were really creative and there were four different models of houses. They would creatively sprinkle those. But typically, people, they came in and they bought it and they worked for the corporation that moved them there for 3 years or 4 years. And then they moved away, and it was kind of a monopoly thing where they're investing a certain amount of money, and then the market would appreciate over 4 years and they'd get a little bump from that. They go to the next place. But, here in Madrid, when I was thinking about that, not only do we have actual real history where things really happened, but, a few years ago, I was at a funeral for, there was a couple that actually both had died, and they were grandparents in the community at this point. And we had a funeral, and there was not the benefit of clergy, you might say. This was a funeral that was put on by the community. And I got a chance to see families who I knew the parents that are now grandparents. I knew the children. I taught some of them when they were children. Well, those children, they're grown now and they have children. And some of them have grown and have passed away already. And I saw how these families were woven together and how they got strength from each other, particularly in times of difficulty, like a difficult passing like this.
So you mentioned an authentic community is one in which real things happen, and that's what I'm thinking is that the people are able to connect with one another when they share experiences, right? And like going through, and I guess this could happen in a bedroom community too. You could go
Negative as
through
well as positive.
a
Yes.
natural disaster or something, and your
Right.
neighbor could help you out, and suddenly it's more of a community than it was before. And
Almost by degrees of interdependence, as we were talking about.
yeah. I did want to go back though, because what I was fishing for earlier about my question about human psychology and why doesn't it work to have an intentional community that's all people I like? Because I think things could happen, right? So that box can get
The
checked.
agitator ball in the can of paint.
Well, yeah, but there might be more to that. So one thing that I was thinking is that to the extent that we haven't done all of our cleaning up work, the people that annoy us could be described as mirrors of ourselves, right? And so if we're only surrounding ourselves with people that don't annoy us, for one thing, that might be impossible because if we haven't done our cleaning up work, we're going to project stuff and we're going to be annoyed by people, right? So that might just be a misnomer. But beyond that, we also miss the opportunity to chafe against people that we disagree with, which is a growth catalyst. So, is that why a community of people we like wouldn't work? Or what if they've all done a bunch of waking up and cleaning up work? And yeah, does that bring anything up for you?
Sure. Well, I think we all know people who have the luxury of only being surrounded by people that they like.
I don't know if I do.
We call them celebrities.
Oh yeah,
And we know that as a class of people, these people can get way far from shore.
yeah.
This is a problem of the very rich and the very powerful is they get surrounded by yes men. That's traditionally what people say. If a person in a position of power is lucky enough to have someone there to say to their face, to look them in the eye and say, "You are full of shit here, pal," they better hold on to that person. And you know who that person was traditionally? Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well.
Mm.
A man of infinite jest. Yes, that was the rule of the fool, who could say anything and not get his head chopped off. Because only a wise king knows that he needs to hear that. He knows that he needs to, like the conversation we just had is, part of it was we need to hear more criticism. We know there's plenty of stuff to improve, but it's hard to get honest criticism because people are afraid of hurting your feelings or they're afraid of hurting their own futures, right? So
And because it's also difficult to formulate criticism.
it is. That's true. That's true. But so that's what a community does. It provides those people that maybe do chafe us, that maybe do point out the elements of ourselves that are still rough and need a little work, or that need a little more development. Uh, or, maybe they need us for that purpose. Maybe we need to chafe them. We were talking about Michael T, and what Michael T represented was the very, I know it's not a cool archetype, but he was the grumpy old white guy, not necessarily grumpy. I'm probably grumpier than him, but that's the archetype, you know. And but what do those people serve in a community is they serve a certain continuity. They become we call them pillars. And what does a pillar do? The pillar holds up the whole damn thing, right? And so that's what we used to look to our elders for. I was on a legal case, federal court, 5.5, almost 6 weeks, and I was with some Navajo guys. And I said to one of the older Navajo guys, I said, how do you guys figure stuff out on the reservation? And he said, well, we all get together in the chapter house, and everybody who has something to say speaks, and all the old people listen, and then they tell us what the deal is.
The
you
first
know
part of that is part of what Bohm was looking for around dialogue. Like one of the tenets he uses is speaking to the center of the room and not to one another. And the idea is you're putting all the perspectives into the middle of the room so everyone can get a good look, or in this
and
case,
there are
so the elders can.
some great Native American traditions around respecting age and the elders and the things that they've seen and the things that they've understood, and respecting their role to put us in place once in a while. And if we only have what we like, we lose the ability to do that. Like my teacher Peter, he was talking about Grandmaster Cho. And he said, sometimes when Cho was training me, I would just hate him, and then we'd finish and I'd like him again. Okay. you know but yeah, because sometimes we need people to push us where we can't go. Sometimes we need people to say, hey, you stepped on my toe, or you can do better. I know you can do better. And sometimes we don't want to hear that. But those are the things that sometimes a community can provide us with, and it can grow us up. That's this idea of it takes a village. Well, a village has to function as a village. It has to interdepend. And if you build a picture of modern life, that the stronger and the better off I get, the less I need to depend on other people, the less I need other people. That's kind of the old picture, right? And that's the not moving from independence into interdependence. Now we know that just being rich, they say, I think the research said, once you're making over about 75,000 bucks a year, it may not help. Now that was 2 years ago, so they probably now that's
Probably.
$275,000 a year. But the idea is that past a certain point, you're maybe buying off some of the compounds that would be polishing you if you let the abrasion happen, right?
So, so we touched on authentic community not being a place that's only people we like, and we touched on it being a place where real things happen, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about more. Are there other tenets of what you would consider an authentic community? And I'll caveat that I've got in my mind that I'm holding up against this, like,
Uh-huh.
well, real things happen in a city, right? And we certainly deal with people we don't like in a city. And so what makes real community possible or not, kind of in different environments that people choose to live in, is where I'm going.
Well, you know what? Uh, Somebody that I worked for a long time ago had spent time, I think, in New York City, and this was his code: was you can always afford to piss a few people off because there's always more people. That does not work in a small town, because pretty soon you're through all the people. And so I connect that with why I see all the worst behaviors that I see typically in urban and suburban settings, because there has been that kind of uh, there's this idea that if you're talking to a room of 10 people, each person only feels 10% responsible for hearing what you're saying. If you talk to a room with 100 people, they only listen with 1%. That idea. Well, when you're in the five boroughs, there's millions of people, and you can be sure that most of them aren't listening at all, right? So and what I've seen over my lifetime has been a steady decline in the humanity with which they treat each other. And I think that's an inversion from the way it used to be. Out west, we used to have the problem of gulch popping, you know, where there's just you and there's just him, or you're just coming back from the gold mine with what you got, and they're just coming to the gold mine, and there you are, and there they are, and there's a pickaxe, and I don't know what happened.
There's a great there's a great short film. I don't know if you've seen The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. It's a Coen Brothers movie that's a collection of short films. And there's one starring Tom Waits as a prospector who spends all this time and energy digging. It's just him and the mule out there, and then something happens. And it's a. I mean, I really like Tom Waits as an actor, so it's a
Oh,
kind of a treat.
yep,
And Coen Brothers produce like no one else.
yep,
So,
yep. No, I remember that as an insult from some old Western movie. "Well, he ain't no gulch popper."
uh-huh.
Nobody knew what is a gulch popper. Well, that's what a gulch popper is. Somebody will take advantage of you when you're alone and there's nobody to see, no witnesses, right?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if it's true that people behave better in smaller communities. I want to believe that. I don't
No, I
know.
know. Maybe, maybe not. I think there's just a type of person that leaves regularly. You see that in a small town. It's like they'll come, they'll run a number, everybody will get wise. Their number doesn't work, they leave. I think that's a often that applies to expats. But anyway, there's a function in a community, an interdependence that's almost forced on you, I think. And so it does kind of maybe force us out of our comfort spot and push us into some learning curves that we might not know about, you know. And you can have some realizations too around that. You know, there's people that I've been in this community now near on 40 years, and there are people that I was always seen as very liberal, and there's folks that were always seen as very conservative. And over the years, it turns out that when we have to face an issue, we always come up on the same side and we stand together around things. And we realize that even though that seemed like they had such a different worldview, we actually we share certain principles. And, maybe we share more than we disagree on. I feel like I saw that with the New Village Alliance program too. It
Mhm.
wasn't just liberals and it wasn't just conservatives that came up to support us. It wasn't just Christians, it wasn't just atheists, it wasn't just, it turns out that there is a baseline humanity and that we do share a lot more than certain contexts will reveal. Let's put it that way.
That does make me think that some of the way I think about building community in a city has to do with finding people with shared interests and figuring out where they congregate and joining them there, which is and we do think of that as I'm part of this community, I play chess with these people, and I go to synagogue with these people, and I go to the
I
gym
share
with these people.
samenesses with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and we do think of that as being a part of those communities, but that's kind of a really different understanding of community than what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And it's more like it's closer to family, you know? And I think the community, when I say authentic community, obviously, I've white and blacked something that's all grays, and with the idea that we want to increase our level of community by valuing it, by nurturing it, right? By realizing that there is something that we reap from it that's worth protecting. I think I mentioned in our earlier conversation about Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, and the book "The Small is Beautiful," and he talks about a lot of those same values. When I was young, uh, there was a group that I was in where, adolescents are kind of in a special place psychologically as well as chronologically. And this group would have, uh, there were two different practices. One is called a care circle and one is called a spit circle. Have you ever heard of those?
I think I've heard of a care circle.
Okay. Well, a spit circle is the other side.
Uh-huh.
Right. And what these are, for people who aren't familiar with it, is you have a group, and it's like a group exercise. And basically, a care circle, everybody's sitting in a circle. One person goes into the center, and everybody says the positive feelings that they have for that person. It's very warm and fuzzy. And then the spit circle is exactly the opposite. Person goes into the center, and everybody says, well, what pisses me off about you is when you do this or when you do that or and these things, it seems like that could be potentially self-flagellation. But what happens is there becomes a way that the group can come to know itself So it moves more towards the relationship one would hope in an ideal family and less like a group of unrelated people only pursuing their own self-interests. And that somehow you get a glimpse from that, that maybe this is a better way to be, but we've sort of we've sort of lost that, we sort of fantasize about what a tribal situation would be, where there is a collective something. I won't even define it, but that becomes a mutual resource for people out of their collectivity. Um, so I think I mentioned in a ceremony seeing a little South American tribesman looking out through my eyes, seeing the Western world and saying, "Oh, your tribes are all broken and they don't take care of you." Well, the other side of that, that we also spoke about with Carl Rogers and the idea of humanistic psychology, that some situations that humans get into, other humans are the cure for that. Like we just haven't mixed the humans thoroughly enough and our batter's coming out lumpy, right? We need to spread that humanistic essence over the weak spots, right? To fix the things that need to get fixed. That's a natural function of community, I think, when things are intact and functioning, like raising young is, that there's a self-righting mechanism, self-organizing, self-balancing, self-righting kind of.
You raised that a couple of times, that sometimes being around other people, and this is my word, not yours, um, is medicine. And I don't mean being around people in general, but being around a specific person who's got something that is relevant for you, which may not be remotely intuitive, might not be the thing you think you're looking for. And you also, when you were talking about the spit circle, so I've heard that as sweet and salty feedback, and I came across that in the context of wilderness therapy. And when a kid graduates from wilderness therapy, his peers all tell him what they think he should keep in mind when he leaves,
Right.
and it's not all nice.
Of course.
It's like, "Hey, you've got a real problem with this. You're not over it. Keep an eye on that."
Which is a testimony to the foundation of trust that's been built in that relationship.
For
And that's
sure.
what should be said about the spit circle,
Yeah,
is that
right.
if there's not genuine caring there, then you just have a bunch of spit,
Yeah.
and that's no good, right? So these are like the yin and the yang that kinda work together. Uh,
But my question, where I was going was, you said the whole group moves together in a way, and then a couple minutes later, you came back to a collective. I'm not even sure we can give it a name, but I'm fishing for that because,
uh-huh,
in dialogue, um, there's a very kind of non hard to describe, but very present emphasis on collective self awareness, shared meaning, shared understanding. And I've always struggled with differentiating that from a bunch of individual self awareness or individual meaning residing together. There's
right,
a subtle
right.
difference.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I can describe that, but I wondered if you were close and might be able to.
Well, it's synergy, isn't it? If the sum total of the parts being greater than the mere addition of their parts, that are now our partness as well as our agency is employed.
Mhm.
Now all the pieces are using both pieces, both parts.
So kinda back to the whole-on idea that we
Back to the
talked about
whole on
last time,
model.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And no, I think that there's quite a phenomenon there. That we've proven, okay, that I can't pull the reference, but I know that the basic study was you give people problems, they try to solve them uh, alone, solo, and they solve it about 40%. You put them together and you let them talk about it. There's no new people in the room. There's no new information in the room, but through the practice of dialogue, now they all go up to about 80%. So so that's the idea is that we get a cumulative effect if we can manage to do this. We see this in teams, right? One of the reasons that team sports I think are so fascinating as they are is that we see people in the context of team sports maybe being able to perform to levels that they would not have performed if they didn't have that coordination and support and the intellectual the psychological rather connectedness that generates good teamwork. I can remember experiences of that just solving technical problems. Uh, when we go to a situation of water gushing down the street and me and a couple helpers are able to go to this situation where everything's wrong and then we throw ourselves at it and we work together and we have to communicate about it and we have to depend on each other to some degree and then coordinating it all and then all of a sudden everything's back to normal and everything's working right. And there is a hit off of that
For sure.
that to just do stuff yourself, and I've done plenty of both, to sit in your shop and make a nice piece of something and it's finished and you pat yourself on the back. It requires a stronger sense of identity, you know, than being part of a team. Being part of a team carries us along. So we definitely have the software for that, and it could be that we just haven't harmonized it right yet, so that we need to represent that potential to each other and not just a threat to our survival.
Say more about threat to our survival.
Well, I mean, I think that that's part of maybe a conversation about pseudo community because I do feel like we're in a time when maybe people aren't feeling supported because of a lot, resulting in a lot of the things that you mentioned at the very beginning. Uh, and so, because we don't feel supported by a natural sense of community, we might be willing to go to places to find community that are not necessarily natural communities. I think that there's a corporate thing. This is one of the reasons that when people start talking about work-life balance and the conversation is coming from management, that's where I tend to rankle. Because from my seat, I want to fit my work into my life. I don't want to fit my life into my work. And it's a matter of precedent, right? So, in a lot of settings, there's actually, and Schumacher talks about this, about why when corporations, and I grew up this way, so I saw it. My dad worked for IBM. So I lived in uh, one place in Ohio, in Cleveland. Then I lived in Toledo. Then I lived in Michigan. Then I lived back in Cleveland. Then I lived in New York. Then he went down. Then they went down to Florida, and that was about when I was out. But the idea was you want to be moved. And Schumacher explains that the psychology was we want your loyalty to the corporation. We don't want your loyalty to your community. We don't want your loyalty to the hospital or the library, or we don't want you hanging out with friends in the community. We want your friends to be other people that work for the corporation. So you'll hang out. We're going to make social clubs inside the corporation. You're going to hang out with other corporation people. And you're even going to feel that if you don't do that, your career is going to be in jeopardy. And we're going to set it up that way. And then after we've moved you 3 or 4 times, this was so endemic that IBMers, my dad worked for IBM, they said IBM stood for I've been moved, right? I mean, is that part of the agenda? But the idea is that all the loyalties go to the corporation and no longer goes to the organic community that's based on your regional identity. That's something that Wendell Berry goes into in great depth. Uh, in a rural setting, you have to learn how to live in a rural setting. We may say, "Oh, look, there's a field. You can put sheep in it." Well, not every sheep works on every field. It turns out that every field's a little different, every sheep's a little different. But Wendell Berry talks about how it took him decades to learn what to plant where and what kind of animals go where. And there's a regional association that pulls against corporate agendas. So So, well, what else have we lost though when we've torn those roots out? When we've been transplanted, we break a lot of roots. And we go through a shock period, just like a plant where we have to reestablish those roots. Well, and then we get pulled up again. Well, we're now a different kind of plant. We're going to grow in a different way, and we might be a little stunted. That was Schumacher's argument. That's why he said as soon as it gets to a certain size, we cap it, you spawn off a whole nother company because we're going to dehumanize our people once we go past a certain size. That was his argument. That was what was small is beautiful, was the idea behind that, the
Yeah.
name of the book.
After not moving for a really long time, I have moved around a lot lately, and one thing that I've become a lot more aware of is that in the that it takes me, might be different for other people, 3 to 6 months to feel like my routine is solid again. I can try to transplant the routine from where I moved from to where I moved to, but it won't work. The environment is different. The interactions I have are different. The distances that I have to go and the mode by which I go there are different for different things. And so, like, it just takes some reformulating.
It calls for a slightly different you.
Right, right. And it is really disruptive, and it's also chafing in the growth way.
Uh-huh,
You know,
sure.
to
Uh-huh,
have to establish a new routine, you kind of have to ask yourself, what do I want to preserve, and what do I no longer need each time also. So there's some
right.
helpful elements to that. But your point's taken about, what does get uprooted when we move. I would just footnote, I think a lot of what you're calling corporations, which I think is a pejorative. Um,
Well, I'm quoting Schumacher in that.
okay. I think a lot of organizations are thinking very differently about organizational health being an outcome of individual health, as opposed
Sure.
to existing somehow independently of that. And I think it's obvious.
Schumacher's revelation was a postmodern realization in the earlier phases of that.
Can you explain that?
Well, the way that I always think about it is that the modern age was, let's make everything out of plastic and linoleum, and there's absolutely no downsides to any of this. And the 50s is what I think of, the 1950s. And it's really industrial and it's really sparse and it's really kind of metallic and inhuman. And then people started realizing that, well, plastic's great, but I don't really want that plastic factory right next door. And it does seem that maybe some of the things that are so great, they may have some real downsides. And that's where the NIMBY idea came. Not in my backyard. It's like I still want the benefits from it, but I want it in someone else's backyard. And so that sort of spurred the postmodern idea that maybe this isn't all roses and sunshine. Maybe there's some downsides. We need to pay attention to the law of unforeseen consequences. We need to realize that all that glitters is not gold.
It's interesting. I've never thought of that as central to kind of the postmodern worldview. When I think postmodern, I think breaking down everything we know into how that is an outcome of some combination of culture and power, and then trying to figure out where that power is derived from, and
Right.
what
That's
disrupting it
critical
looks like.
theory. Right.
Yeah, but you're talking about a pretty different thing here. Um, so just to feed that back to you, you're talking about where the modern era was not so concerned with the consequences of, let's say, building and consuming. Postmodern doubled back and wanted to assess the consequences of those things.
Yeah, it's all just one big, enormous Chesterton's gate or his fence, if you will.
Can you explain that reference?
Right. Well, the Chesterton's gate idea is that here's this gate or this fence. I think you see it as both. And it was here when we came, and we don't know why it's here. And then for some reason, it offends us, so we're going to tear it down. And then it turns out that, oh, that was there because da 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 da. Now we've created a problem for ourselves. And I think that the modern postmodern thing, I was born uh, in the at the height of the modern age, I would say, before postmodernism had really gotten a grip. And the idea, for example, then was that a baby is a blank slate. And so you can hand off a baby to anybody and they can just write whatever they want on that blank slate. Now we come to realize, duh, things have their own organic nature and that we maybe have to take that into consideration. It's like the conversation, can we build a perfect society, or is it a natural thing that we use a horticultural mindset towards cultivating and nurturing rather than let's saw this off and build one over here, and is it a car or is it a bonsai plant? And the postmodern realization is to come to think that maybe we need to look more deeply. Maybe we need to understand things more in their nature. Now, whether we can even do that is a philosophical argument, right? Some philosophers argue, like Kant has this idea where he separates between noumena and phenomena. He says we can only experience phenomena, but the thing in itself is the definition of the noumena, that somehow we'll never know the thing in itself. All we know is this. So there's this idea that at least maybe we should be trying to understand the inner nature of things a little better. That might be the difference between harmonious and elegant and forced and unnatural. But humans have that. There's a refinement that goes on there. There's someone nearby here who has quite a penchant for putting rocks up on their ends. So he's got his whole little thing going. I don't know if you've driven by and seen that, but so I always think of that as the Fushi Zen garden, right? We have the idea of a Zen garden. Everybody knows that, but very few people know Fushi Zen. Fushi Zen means unnatural, right? So so in a Zen garden, you might have a waterfall, but you would never have a fountain squirting water up in the air like in a Western fountain, because that's Fushi Zen. That's, this idea that we want to put things in imbalanced, unnatural conditions. Well, artists are telling us about their internal condition, right? And a lot of times it's disturbing, right? And so we get a communication of that. Maybe we learn something from that. Other art might pacify us and put it. But anyway, a digression. Uh, so I associate postmodernism as a kind of a whoa Nelly kind of an approach, a response, a knee jerk reaction to modernism. We realize I wrote a paper. I guess it wasn't even a paper. Maybe it was just a long ranting letter that I never wrote, but it was about wisdom and knowledge are going somewhere on a road trip, and knowledge drives off while wisdom is in the bathroom in the gas station. And that's kind of where Western culture is. And knowledge has the credit card, but wisdom had the map, right? So so we get this kind of thing where we've got, and I know there's famous quotes about that, how we need to have lessons in morality for every step in power that we take, right? So, so we are kind of in this like the images of a cartoon character holding a fire hose that's just swinging him all around the place. We're going for this ride, but we're supposed to be the ones in control and creating this technology that's doing this, right? So yeah, postmodernism is kind of like, okay, maybe there is a point in time where we should pump the brakes on modernism and remember that uh, we get this word physics. Physics comes from the Greek physis. And in Greek philosophy, we used to have they had this distinction between by techne or by physis, right? So by physis is by nature, by techne is by the hands of man, and they're different. There's a distinction there. The book when Aristotle he wrote Physis, the book on nature, and then he wrote another book on cosmology that was after that book, and that book was called Metaphysis, right, or metaphysics, because it's the book after the book on we get physics, but he was writing more about nature, right? And so again, there's this kind of this polarity there. But so yeah, that's how I think about postmodernism is the little silent screaming voice screaming into the hurricane that just because we can doesn't mean we should. Uh, that the law of unforeseen consequences is reality, and we need to walk like the Taoists say, like crossing a stream in the winter, right, on the frozen ice, uh, uh, which it seems like we're not, but that's a whole other conversation about paradigm shift.
Well, I really love the image of knowledge leaving wisdom behind at the gas station, and knowledge has the credit card and wisdom has the map. That's great. That might need to go on a T-shirt.
Yeah.
What is community's role in reuniting wisdom and knowledge?
I think in authenticity, I think we've kind of been bamboozled out of real community by shiny things, and I think we're now coming to a point where we're realizing that some of these shiny things are bullshit, and so maybe we wanna realize some of these things that went out with the bathwater. People are looking for meaning. People are looking for connection. We know now that happiness is more related to our connection, our degree of connection, than it is to our stuff. Big surprise. Well, that's that part of the brain that we don't give much attention to. The part that underlines our partness. Well, what is our partness but our connection or our potential connection to the thing that we are a part of, which is this self-organizing system of humanity, whether it's at our village level or at a global level. The dynamics are different, but the song remains the same, I think.
And you think we can consider ourselves in some practical way global citizens? Or I mean, you just mentioned, kind of. I know we're all interconnected, and we can perceive the field that way. I guess I have a hard time living my day to day life through the lens of being interconnected with everyone, right?
Uh-huh.
The container feels a lot closer than that most days.
Right, right. Well, I think we're just seeing the footprints of this bull. I don't think we've grabbed it by the horns quite yet. I started out this my day today with a conversation with Uganda, over very practical matters, right? Uh, so that's an example of the potential there, but I don't think it's realized. I think that there's major reorganization of caterpillar parts into butterfly parts before we'll see all that realized. I think there's glimmers though. There's clues. We've seen the footprints, so we know the beast is out there. That might be all we get right now.
Reminds me of the idea of the imaginal cell, and thinking of certain individuals as the imaginal cells that are carrying the blueprint for what the butterfly is going to look like, and they might not even know they're carrying it.
Right. That holographic function
Yeah.
of the whole being carried in the part. Yeah. And therefore must have an instinct for that whole that it's a part of. That's what that, and I think that. I feel like I've felt that. I feel
Hmm.
like I've glimpsed that,
Hmm.
you know. Uh
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that might be a stopping point. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap?
let's see. I guess I feel like, there was a historian named Pitrim Sorokin, and he had this idea of cycles, through history. And he would kind of graph these. So, like, you would see the petroleum age as a parabola. You'd see the matriarchy, patriarchy pendulum as this big, slow uh, sine wave kind of moving through history. You'd see, you could graph a lot of things this way. You can put technology on there, and you can see petroleum, of course, is a explication of that. But you can see the electronic age on there. You can see. So I think that there's probably a rural urban thing there too. And I think that maybe things bounce back and forth a ways, you know. And so I do think that, you know, maybe Wendell Berry and Edward Abbey and some of these writers, because you know, often the artists are intuiting things before the culture really gets there. And maybe some of these guys and the understanding of the necessity of the things we've been swinging away from for so long. And I feel like the crises that we're facing now might be all part of that point in history where certain of those things start to swing back the other way. So, you know, people say the internet is dehumanizing. It might also be a way for us to recommunitize too somehow. And so yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I do think that community is a part of the puzzle, as is communication and self-expression and, you know, all that connection. So yeah, exciting time to be alive. Uh, I don't think that I don't think that it's worth being pessimistic about things. Let's put it that way. I think that there's just so much more now that we hear a lot more than maybe we were used to. So maybe we have to turn our hearing aids down in that respect. I think that these times of great change are also times of great opportunity. So yeah, that's the thought I think to keep in mind.
Mhm. Good. Well, thank you, Brian. And regards to Michael T's family and
Yeah,
condolences.
very much.
And we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.